I didn't plan to say anything. That was the decision I made in the car, sitting in the parking lot of my brother's house for 6 minutes before I finally opened the door. I had given myself that time, 6 minutes, engine running, hands on the wheel just to breathe. Just to remind myself why I was there and what I was not going to do. I was not going to defend myself. I was not going to explain myself. I was not going to give anyone at that table the satisfaction of watching me flinch. I turned off the engine, checked my lipstick in the rearview mirror, and walked up the driveway. My name is Claire Novak. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life, I have been the family secret nobody bothered to hide. Let me explain what I mean by that. My brother Derek is 6 years older than me. He graduated top of his class from Georgetown, passed the bar on his first attempt, and married a woman named Stephanie, whose father owns 3 commercial properties in Charlotte. By the time I was old enough to understand what any of that meant, Derek had already become the fixed point around which my entire family orbited. Every holiday, every phone call, every passing conversation eventually found its way back to him. What Derek was doing, what Derek had accomplished, what Derek was planning next. I used to think it was just admiration, the natural kind, the kind families have for their brightest member. It took me years to understand it was something else entirely, that my parents hadn't just chosen a favorite. They had quietly, almost gently, decided that the story of our family had one main character, and it wasn't me. I was not the cautionary tale. That would have at least required acknowledgement. I was something harder to name, the background, the static, the part of the picture you don't focus on. My mother once introduced me to her book club friends as Derek's little sister. She works in restaurants. I was 24 at the time. I had been working in restaurants since I was 17. First as a hostess, then as a server, then as a shift lead at a mid-range Italian place called Rosario's in Raleigh, where I had also been quietly helping the owner manage vendor invoices and scheduling for 2 years, because he trusted me, and because I was good at it, and because nobody in my family had ever asked what I actually did at work, so there was no one to tell. I didn't mind the work. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. There is a version of this story where I resented every table I waited on, where I felt humiliated every time I refilled a glass, where I burned quietly for years waiting for the moment I could prove something. That isn't my story. I loved the rhythm of a busy service. I loved the problem-solving of it, the physical intelligence required, the way a good team could move through a packed dining room like something choreographed. I was proud of what I did. I just wasn't proud of what my family made of it. "She's a waitress," my father would say, when someone asked. Not unkindly, just flatly. The way you'd describe a weather pattern. The thing that actually hurt wasn't the word. It was the period at the end of it. The way the sentence closed. No follow-up, no curiosity, no she's working towards something, or she's learning the industry. Just the period. Waitress. End of story. I had been trying to write a different ending for 3 years by the time that Christmas happened. After Rosario's, I had started doing small private events on weekends, dinner parties, birthday celebrations, a couple of corporate lunches for a real estate office that a regular customer had referred me to. I was doing all of it out of my apartment, with a folding table I'd bought secondhand and a set of chafing dishes I'd found at an estate sale. It wasn't glamorous. Some nights I drove home at midnight with my car smelling like roasted garlic and my feet aching in a way that felt personal, like the floors themselves were trying to tell me something. But the clients were happy. They were more than happy. They were referring me to other people. And those people were referring me to others. And by that October, I had enough recurring business that I had to make a decision about whether I was still a person with a side project or a person running a company. I registered the LLC on a Tuesday morning, by myself, at a Panera booth with my laptop and a medium roast coffee. I named it Ember Hospitality. I told my parents about it that weekend. My mother said, "That sounds like a lot of overhead." My father asked if I was still keeping my shifts at Rosario's as a backup. I said yes, even though I had already given notice. I don't know why I said yes. I think I was still, at 28 years old, hoping that the next sentence would be different, that someone would lean in and ask a real question, that someone would see the thing I was building and recognize it as a thing worth building. Derek didn't even ask what I'd named it. What I didn't know then, what I found out much later, and what I want to tell you about now because it matters to everything that comes after, is that 6 months earlier, my brother had called Rosario's. He had spoken to Marco, the owner, and told him that he was a regular customer who had concerns about the professionalism of some of the staff. He didn't name me directly. He was too careful for that. But he described a specific incident, one that hadn't happened, one that was specific enough to be about one person, and suggested that Marco might want to look into it. I only found this out because Marco told me himself, 2 years later, over coffee, after I had catered his daughter's engagement party, and he had had enough wine to feel like he owed me something true. He said he hadn't believed it. He said he'd known it was nonsense the moment he heard it. But he'd also said it had made things complicated. And complicated was why he'd had to let me go when he'd cut staff that spring. I had lost my job because my brother had made a phone call. By the time I learned that, I had already built something he couldn't touch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Christmas that year was at Derek and Stephanie's house in Cary. They had moved in September into a place with a double-height entryway and a kitchen that had been featured in a local design blog. My mother had sent me the link to the blog post 3 times. Not to share something beautiful to remind me of the distance between us. I drove down from Raleigh alone. I had been dating someone that year. A structural engineer named Paul, who was steady and kind, and who had once spent an entire Saturday helping me research commercial kitchen equipment without complaining once. I had considered bringing him. I had ultimately decided no. Not because I was ashamed of him, but because I didn't want him to see what happened at those dinners. I didn't want to have to explain it in the car on the way home. There were 11 people at the table that night. My parents, Derek and Stephanie, Stephanie's parents who were named Gerald and Miriam, and who wore matching Christmas sweaters without any apparent irony, 2 of Derek's law firm colleagues and their spouses, and me. I had brought a salted caramel tart I'd made that morning, which Stephanie had accepted at the door with the particular smile people use when they've already planned the desserts. Dinner was fine, in the way that those dinners are always fine on the surface. The food was catered, by a company I recognized. And I will admit that I spent a silent moment assessing their presentation and thinking I could have done it better before I reminded myself that was not the energy I was bringing to the table. Literally. The conversation moved the way it always did in that house. Gerald asked Derek about a case he was working on. Derek answered at some length. Miriam asked Stephanie about a renovation they were planning. My father mentioned something about the neighborhood, the property values, the school district. My mother mentioned Derek again. Something about an article in the alumni magazine. I ate my food. I refilled my water glass. I answered the questions that were directed at me, which were not many. Then, Derek's colleague, a man named Richard, who had the handshake of someone who had taken a weekend seminar on confident handshakes, asked the table, in that broad Christmas dinner way, what everyone was up to these days. Everyone answered in turn. Gerald mentioned retirement. Miriam mentioned a garden project. Stephanie mentioned the renovation. My mother mentioned Derek's article again. And then Richard looked at me and smiled the polite smile and asked, "And what do you do, Claire?" I opened my mouth. But Derek got there first. "Claire's in the service industry," he said, cutting his prime rib without looking up. "She's always had a knack for it. Great at taking care of people." He said it lightly. The way you'd describe a pleasant hobby. Then he looked at Richard and said, "She basically runs errands and serves food at parties," and he laughed. And Richard laughed, and my father smiled into his glass, and my mother reached over to touch Stephanie's arm about something else entirely. And just like that, I had been described and dismissed in the same sentence. I picked up my fork. The table moved on. I sat there, and I thought about the 6 minutes in the parking lot. I thought about the decision I had made with the engine running. And then I thought about a Wednesday 3 weeks earlier, when I had been standing in a hotel conference room in downtown Raleigh, going over the layout for a 200-person corporate holiday event with a venue coordinator named Tanya. And Tanya had said, "Your team is the best we've worked with all season," and I had looked around at the 4 people I'd hired and trained and thought, quietly, "Yes, I know." I set my fork down. Richard's wife, a woman named Dana, who had been largely quiet through dinner, but who had the watchful quality of someone who notices things, looked at me and said, "What kind of events do you do?" I said, Corporate, mostly. Some private. We just finished a season-end event for a tech company out of Durham, about 200 guests. Before that, a product launch for a pharmaceutical company. We're finishing the year with a fundraiser gala in February, 400 people. Black tie. The table didn't go silent. Not yet. Dana nodded and said that sounded like real work, and I thanked her. And I thought that was probably the end of it. But then Richard put down his fork. He looked at me with the particular focus of someone who has just processed information and is working out whether it means what he thinks it means. "What did you say your company was called?" he asked. "Ember Hospitality," I said. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did the Morrison Group dinner in October." I said yes. A 40-person client appreciation dinner at a private residence in Raleigh, mid-October. Richard said, "I was there. I work with the Morrison Group on 2 of their accounts." He turned to his wife and said, "Dana, this is the company I told you about. The one Henderson wouldn't stop talking about. He said it was the best corporate event he'd been to in years." He looked back at me. "Henderson is one of our biggest clients," he said. "I've been trying to get his company name on a sponsorship for 8 months. He's mentioned your team twice in conversations about what kind of hospitality experience he expects from the people he works with." I said I was glad to hear that. I said Henderson's team had been wonderful to work with. The table was quiet now. Not the polite, passing quiet of a conversation ending. A different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a room recalibrates. My mother had stopped talking to Stephanie. Gerald had set down his wine glass. My father was looking at me with an expression I did not know how to read, because I had not seen it on his face before. Derek had not looked up from his plate, but his jaw had changed. Richard said, "I've actually been looking to bring on a hospitality partner for our client events division. We do about a dozen events a year, some of them significant. I've had a hard time finding someone who understands what corporate clients actually need rather than just what looks good in a portfolio." I said that was something I understood well. He said he'd like to have a real conversation about it. He said he'd have his assistant reach out in January. I said that would be wonderful. I gave him my card. A real card, with the Ember Hospitality logo on matte white stock, the one I had designed with a freelance graphic designer I'd paid properly and whose work I was proud of. Dana smiled at me across the table. It was a real smile. Derek's colleague on the other side, who had said almost nothing all evening, asked me how I had gotten into event catering. I told him a shortened version of the truth. He said his wife had been trying to plan their anniversary party for months and asked if I ever did private events. I said yes, and I gave him a card too. The salted caramel tart came out after dinner. Stephanie presented it without mentioning who had made it. That was all right. I didn't need her to. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I want to tell you that clearly because I think people expect tears in moments like this: release, vindication, the flood of feeling that comes after a long silence. What I actually felt was quieter than that. It was more like the settling of something, the way a house stops making noise when the heat finally reaches the right temperature. A kind of stillness that isn't emptiness. I had not planned for Richard to be at that table. I had not orchestrated anything. I had just shown up, told the truth when I was asked, and let the work speak for itself. That was all. That was everything. My mother called me the following Tuesday. It was the longest call we had had in probably 2 years. She asked questions I didn't recognize as coming from her real questions, curious ones, about how I had built the business, and how many people I employed, and what kinds of events were my specialty. I answered them honestly. I didn't point out that she had never asked before. I didn't remind her of the phone call she had made to me 3 years ago, the one where she had said, with the gentleness of someone who thinks they're being kind, that she hoped I was thinking about something more stable, something with benefits, something more like what Derek had. I just answered her questions. Before she hung up, she said, "I didn't know it had gotten to this size, Claire." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes, that was it." There wasn't a big apology. There wasn't a reckoning. No one sat across from me and accounted for the years of being described as a waitress at dinner tables and book club meetings and holiday conversations. No one explained why they had let me be a footnote in my own family for a decade. Some things don't resolve the way you imagine them resolving when you're 22, and exhausted, and lying in your apartment at midnight, telling yourself it will be different when you've made something real. The difference isn't a moment. It's a morning. It's a Tuesday call. It's small and imperfect and not enough, but it's not nothing. Derek did not call. I didn't expect him to. What I did not expect was what came next, 3 months later, when I was meeting with my accountant to close out the first full fiscal year of Ember Hospitality, and my accountant told me that someone had called her office last year an anonymous inquiry. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, asking questions about whether my business was registered, whether I had outstanding debts, whether there were any liens, phishing questions, the kind someone asks when they're looking for something to use. I asked her when. She told me the month. It was the same month I had told my family about the LLC. I don't have proof. I want to be careful here. I don't have a recording. I don't have a number. I have a timing and a history, and the particular clarity that comes from finally stopping to look at the shape of things. I have Marco's conversation over coffee. I have an anonymous inquiry that came from someone who knew what I had just registered and when. I have a brother who described me as someone who runs errands and serves food at parties to a room full of people and didn't flinch while doing it. I have enough. I have not confronted him. I want to tell you why, because I think it's the part of this that surprises people most. They hear the story, and they want the confrontation. They want me to show him the evidence, to lay it all out, to make him say the words. I understand that impulse. For a long time I shared it, but I've been in enough difficult conversations to know what they actually produce, and I've had enough time to think about what I actually want from this situation. And what I want is not a confession. What I want is to keep building what I'm building, without carrying his weight around in my chest. I cut the contact back, significantly. Not dramatically, no announcements, no final speeches, no letter that begins with, "I need you to know." Just distance, the kind that happens naturally, when you stop making the effort that was always only yours to make. I didn't attend his birthday dinner in March. I sent a card. I don't call on Sundays anymore. When my mother asks why, I tell her I've been busy, which is true, and I let her figure out the rest. My parents have been different since Christmas. Not transformed. I'm not telling you a story about transformation, because I don't think transformation is usually what happens. What happens is adjustment. Small corrections. My mother asks questions now. My father mentioned Ember Hospitality to his co-worker's daughter who was planning a wedding, and she booked us for the rehearsal dinner, and he told me about it like he was proud, and I thanked him and meant it. It's not everything. It's not nothing. Richard's company became our third largest client by revenue by the following summer. Henderson signed on for 2 events. Ember Hospitality finished the year with 9 full-time employees, a commercial kitchen lease, and a waiting list for the fall season. I didn't build it to prove anything to anyone at that table. I want to say that again because I mean it and because it matters. I built it because I was good at it, and because I loved it, and because I could see exactly what it could become if I was willing to keep showing up for it, even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching. The hardest thing I ever had to learn is that the watching doesn't make it real. The work makes it real. The Tuesday mornings make it real. The folding table, and the secondhand chafing dishes, and the drive home at midnight smelling like garlic that made it real, long before any room fell silent. I have a team now. Every single one of them. I hired myself. I told them in their first week what I believe about this work, which is that the way you take care of someone at a table or in a tent, or at the end of a long day when they're tired and hungry, is not a small thing. It is not a lesser thing. It is, if you do it right, an act of genuine attention to another person, and genuine attention is among the rarest things one person can offer another. I told them I am proud of this work, and I need them to be proud of it too. Every one of them is. There is one more thing I want to tell you, because I think it is the part of this that I return to most often, the part that I have turned over the most times in the years since. The night of that Christmas dinner, after the plates were cleared and Richard had taken my card, and people were moving around the kitchen with wine glasses and the particular looseness that comes with the end of a holiday meal, I went to use the bathroom and I passed through Derek's office on the way back. The door was open. It was a nice office bookshelves, a big desk, a framed Georgetown diploma, and a family photo from several years ago. I stopped and looked at the photo for a moment. Derek in the center. My parents on either side. Me to the far right, smaller, slightly cut off by the frame. I don't think anyone had done it on purpose. I think that might have been the worst part, that no one had done any of it on purpose. That it had all just happened. The way water finds the shape of a container, without intention, without malice, without anyone having to decide. I looked at that photo for a long time. Then I walked back out to the kitchen, picked up a glass of wine, and had a genuine conversation with Dana about what it was like to build something from nothing. And she told me about a friend of hers who had done something similar with a furniture restoration business. And we stood there for 45 minutes talking about the specific texture of that particular kind of risk. And it was the best conversation I had had in that house in years. I drove home around 10. I called Paul from the car and told him it had been interesting. He asked if I was okay. I said yes, and I meant it, and that was new. I parked in my apartment lot and sat for a moment with the engine running, not because I needed to collect myself the way I had needed to earlier, but because I wanted to notice it, the difference between the person who had parked in that other lot 6 hours ago and the person parking now. Same car, same coat, different weight. I turned off the engine. I went upstairs. I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started drafting the proposal for the February gala. I had work to do.